we need to talk about the operating system. And I don't mean the one on your phone or your laptop. I'm talking about the invisible, sort of scrawling OS that governs how we handle human distress.
Right.
We call it mental health care, and usually the conversation is about, funding or access or the latest drug. But we have a stack of documents here today that suggests we're really missing the forest for the trees.
Or maybe missing the architecture for the furniture.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
We're looking at a source text that's titled The Full-Turn Mental Health System, a deterministic architecture for non-coercive, low-iatrogenic, learning-based care.
It's a mouthful?
It is a mouthful,
Yeah.
and it's dense. It reads almost like an engineering paper. But it makes this very specific, and I have to say a very uncomfortable argument. It says the reason we have a revolving door crisis, the reason coercion is still so prevalent after, 50 years of reform, and the reason medication lists only ever seem to get longer. It's not because we don't care enough. It's not because the patients are too sick.
No, the argument is that the system is structurally designed to stop thinking halfway through the problem.
That's it. That's the core concept we really need to grapple with today, the half-turn. And this isn't, strictly speaking, a medical critique. It's more of a systems engineering critique.
Exactly. The authors are looking at psychiatry as a control system, like a thermostat in your house or an autopilot in a plane. And they're basically saying this machine is missing a crucial feedback wire.
And when a machine like that is missing a feedback wire, it doesn't just, shut down?
No, it does the opposite. It starts working too hard. It starts overcompensating, often in really destructive ways.
So before we jump into the solution, which they call the full turn, we have to really dig in and understand the mechanics of this failure. We need to get why smart, compassionate people who are working inside this system are, forced into patterns that end up producing harm.
Right.
Let's start with that core idea, the half-turn loop. Can you just walk us through what the system actually does when it encounters a person who's in trouble?
Sure. And let's, for a second, just strip away all the medical jargon and just look at the cognitive arc. What's the thought process?
Okay.
Right now, the system runs a very, very short loop. First, it observes. It sees a signal, someone's shouting in the street or someone's sitting in a GP's office crying.
A behavior.
A signal. Second, it classifies. It immediately tries to apply a label: schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder. Step 3, it intervenes. It applies a force. That could be medication, it could be hospitalization, maybe even restraints. And then, what happens then?
Then it stops.
Right. It just stops. Ideally, the symptom gets suppressed, the person goes quiet, the case is marked closed or discharged. And that, right there, is a half-turn.
It's like firing an arrow, hitting the target, and then just walking away.
Precisely.
But let's challenge that for a second. If the person stops shouting or they stop crying, isn't that a success? If I have a broken leg, the doctor sets it, I stop screaming,
Right.
We're done. Why doesn't that same logic hold up here?
Because a broken leg is a structural event. It's a static problem to be solved. But mental distress, that's a dynamic, timeline-based event. It has a past and a future.
Okay.
The source material argues that this half-turn loop is a failure because it refuses to return. It doesn't complete the circle. It actually ignores 3 critical feedback loops.
So what's the first one?
The first is the causal loop. Why was the person shouting in the first place? Was it, a brain chemistry issue, or was it because they're about to be evicted from their apartment and they're terrified? The half-turn system, it
Right.
doesn't really care, not structurally, as long as the shouting stops.
So it's designed to suppress the signal, regardless of what's causing the signal.
Exactly. The second one it misses is the temporal loop. Okay, we intervened. What happens to that person 2 years from now because of what we did? If we hospitalize them to stop the shouting, did that intervention cause them to lose their job?
Right. Did the medication we gave them cause metabolic syndrome 5 years down the line?
Did it? The half-turn system, it almost never checks. And that brings us to the final, and maybe most important, missed loop. The system learning loop.
Does the system itself change?
Does it update its own rules based on those long-term outcomes? If a certain approach keeps leading to homelessness, does the system stop using that approach?
And the answer we see in the real world is largely no.
It's no. So, to use the language from the text, psychiatry as it's currently structured functions as a regulatory control system. Its structural mandate, what society asks it to do, is to manage behavioral variance.
Keep people within the lines.
Keep behavior within normal limits and, crucially, manage risk. But because it ignores those return loops, the why and the what happens later, it ends up in this deep paradox. It successfully suppresses symptoms in the short term.
But it actually generates more instability in the long term.
That's the claim, and it's a huge one.
This is exactly what we're going to unpack today. We're going to look at the anatomy of this failure, piece by piece, and then we're going to look at the blueprint for what they call the full-turn system, an architecture that is designed from the ground up to complete its own reasoning. And I have to say, the thing I found most compelling, really the most radical part of this text, is that it claims this shift isn't just, morally nicer. It's not just a kinder, gentler approach. It claims that if you fix the architecture, things like violence and chronic illness, they decrease mathematically.
It's a deterministic claim. It's an engineering claim. It says if you change the inputs and you change the processing rules, the output must change. It's not a matter of hope.
So let's get into the machinery. Segment 1, the anatomy of failure. Why does this system that we have, this half-turn system, default to force so often? The text introduces a concept that I think is central. It's called feedback truncation.
Yeah.
To me, this just sounds like an engineering term for flying blind.
It's actually a bit worse than flying blind. Imagine you're flying a plane, but the windshield is completely blacked out except for a tiny, tiny sliver right in front of you. And you also have people in the back seat screaming at you every time you hit a little bit of turbulence that's closer to it.
Okay, unpack that.
Feedback truncation means the system receives high fidelity, immediate, and very loud feedback on one specific type of error, but it gets delayed, muffled, or zero feedback on another, often more destructive type of error.
Give us a concrete example. Put us in the room.
Okay. Picture a psychiatrist in a busy emergency room. It's 2 a.m. A patient is brought in, they're agitated, they're talking about wanting to die. The psychiatrist has a choice. Detain them or let them go.
A huge choice.
A huge choice. Now, if they decide not to detain that patient and that patient goes out and jumps off a bridge that night, what happens?
Catastrophe.
Yeah.
The feedback is immediate, it's brutal, it's personal. There's an investigation, a lawsuit, the coroner's report, there's guilt, there are headlines.
Exactly. That is acute risk feedback. The system sees that signal with perfect, terrifying clarity.
And look, that makes sense. We want the system to see that. We want it to prevent that.
Of course we do. We absolutely do. But now let's run the other side of the simulation. Same psychiatrist, same patient. This time, the doctor does detain the patient. They force medication on them. The person survives the night. Great.
A success on paper.
On paper. But let's say because of the trauma of that forced detention and the side effects of the high-dose medication they were put on, that patient develops severe diabetes 5 years later. Or maybe they lose their trust in all authority figures and end up homeless 3 years later because they're too scared to ask for help ever again.
Does that data point, does that ever travel back to the psychiatrist in the ER at 2 a.m.?
Almost certainly not. They're long gone. The connection is never made. That is feedback truncation. The system is hypersensitive to acute, immediate, visible risk like suicide or violence, and it is completely numb to chronic, cumulative, slow-motion harm.
Things like metabolic death, identity erosion, homelessness.
All the slow-burning disasters. The system is blind to them.
So if you're the operator inside that system, the doctor, the nurse, you're naturally, even unconsciously, going to optimize for the things you can see and the things you get punished for.
Precisely. This is straight out of Control Theory 101. It's a known engineering principle. When a regulatory system has poor or delayed feedback on its long-term stability, it compensates by cranking up the gain.
And what is gain in this context?
In engineering, gain is just the strength of the corrective signal. If your thermostat is slow, you might make it overcorrect wildly. In mental health, high gain looks like maximum dose antipsychotics, locked doors, and coercive mental health laws.
So you use excessive force to guarantee the immediate outcome.
Because you have zero data and therefore zero trust in the long-term process, you can't see the future, so you clamp down on the present with everything you've got.
This brings us to another really critical distinction the text makes between variance and mean risk. I think this is so important for listeners to get because it explains why large institutions behave the way they do.
It really does. Institutions are, by their nature, risk-averse, but they are averse to a very specific kind of risk. They are terrified of what are called tail events.
The outliers.
The rare catastrophic outliers. The school shooting, the subway push, the suicide that happens in custody. These are low-probability events, but they have extremely high consequences for the institution.
They're the events that get administrators fired and hospitals shut down.
Correct. So the entire system is architected to suppress variance. It wants to flatten the curve of human behavior. It wants to make absolutely sure that nobody moves too far outside the established lines, because out there in the tails, that's where the dragons are.
But the paper argues that in the process of ruthlessly suppressing that variance, the system accepts or even creates a massive increase in something else. Mean risk.
Yeah, and mean risk is just the average health and well-being of the entire population being treated.
Did you give us an analogy from that?
Think of it like this. Imagine you're in charge of a school playground. To prevent the 1 in a million chance that a child might fall off the top of the jungle gym, you decide to wrap every single child in 3 feet of bubble wrap and make them sit still on a bench all day.
Okay.
The tail event, the catastrophic fall, is avoided. Success. You have suppressed the variance. But what has happened to the mean risk, the average health of those children?
It's plummeted. They're not developing muscles. They're not learning social skills. They're becoming obese. They're miserable.
Exactly. The system accepts a broad, slow, guaranteed decline in the health of the many to avoid a sharp, sudden, and highly visible danger from the one. And that is what happens in mental health. We might heavily sedate 1,000 people to prevent one of them from becoming violent.
I want to push back on that, though, for a minute. Because if I'm a parent and my child is in the middle of a psychotic crisis, I don't really care about mean risk or metabolic syndrome in 10 years. I care that they don't die tonight. I want the system to suppress the variance. Isn't the system just doing exactly what society is asking it to do in that moment?
That is the core tension, isn't it? And in that acute moment, yes, suppression absolutely feels like safety, and sometimes it is. But the paper argues we are fundamentally confusing safety with stasis.
Freezing the person to save them.
We are freezing the person to save them. But the problem is, a human being isn't a piece of meat. You can't keep them frozen forever. Eventually, they have to thaw out and live their life. And because we used overwhelming force to freeze them, when they thaw, they are often more broken, more frightened, and more unstable than they were before.
And that leads directly into the next concept in the text, which they call the coercion cascade.
Yes.
This idea that force isn't just a one-off event. It begets more force.
It's a domino effect. It's a positive feedback loop of the worst kind. Let's build a timeline. Let's imagine a young man. We can call him Michael. He's distressed. He's hearing voices. He's scared. The neighbors get worried. They call the police.
That's the first escalation.
Yeah. The police arrive. Michael is terrified. He doesn't understand what's happening, so he maybe pushes an officer. Now, he's not just sick. He's also an offender, so he's handcuffed.
Second escalation.
Right. He's taken to a locked ward. He's still agitated, so he's injected with a powerful sedative against his will. The system has now won. The variance is suppressed. He is contained.
But what's happened inside Michael's world?
Well, his trust in authority and helpers is probably gone, shattered. His sense of agency, which is this core belief that you have some control over your own life, is just decimated. He now views the entire mental health system not as a refuge, but as a threat.
So 6 months later, when he starts feeling unwell again, when the voices start to whisper, what does he do? Does he pick up the phone and call for help?
No way. He hides it. He runs from it. He tries to suppress it himself, telling no one until he just can't anymore.
Which means the next crisis, when it finally breaks through, is going to be far more explosive.
Exactly. And because it's more explosive, it now requires more force to contain him. The baseline volatility of his system has gone up. The system used coercion to solve the first problem, but in doing so, it created the conditions for a harder, more dangerous second problem down the road.
It creates the instability that it fears.
It really does. And all of this is lubricated by something the text calls legal asymmetry.
This is the legal code that sort of greases the slide into coercion.
It's the invisible hand pushing everyone in one direction. The laws, almost everywhere, are written to severely punish false negatives, but to completely tolerate false positives.
Okay, define those terms in this context.
A false negative is when a doctor fails to detain someone who then goes on to hurt themselves or someone else. If that happens, the doctor faces negligence claims, coroner's inquests, professional ruin. The consequences are immense.
And a false positive?
That's when a doctor detains someone who didn't actually need it. Someone who would have been fine if they'd been sent home. And what happens in that case?
Nothing.
Nothing at all. It's framed as erring on the side of caution. The law effectively sends a constant, powerful message to every clinician. When in doubt, take their freedom.
It structurally biases every single decision toward intervention, toward control.
There is no legal or professional penalty for overtreatment, only for undertreatment.
Which brings us to the primary tool of that control, medication. The paper calls this the polypharmacy ratchet. And we've all seen this, right? Patients on 5, 6, 7 different psychotropic drugs at once. The text argues this isn't just bad practice. It's a structural inevitability.
It is.
Why is it a ratchet? Why does it seem to only turn one way?
Because adding a medication is structurally easy and subtracting one is structurally terrifying.
Unpack that.
Prescribing a new drug is a 5-minute conversation in a busy clinic. It signals action. It makes the patient's anxious family feel like, okay, we're doing something. It satisfies the insurance company's need for a clear intervention. It's fast, it's defensible.
But taking one away.
Deprescribing.
Deprescribing is a high-wire act.
Yeah.
It can take months of careful tapering. You have to manage complex withdrawal symptoms. And crucially, you have to distinguish between rebound effects and a genuine relapse of the illness. And this is where the system fails most tragically, through something called rebound misinterpretation.
Explain that mechanism. It sounds critical.
It is. Your brain is an adaptive organ. It's always seeking balance. If you take a sedative, for example, every day for a year, your brain doesn't just sit there. It fights back. It upregulates its own excitatory receptors to try to counteract the sedation and wake itself up.
It's trying to get back to a baseline.
It's always trying to get to homeostasis. Now, what happens if you suddenly take that sedative away?
Well, those extra excitatory receptors are still there, still wide open. They're wide open, and there's no drug to block them. So you get a massive, overwhelming surge of anxiety, insomnia, agitation, a biological rebound.
And the doctor looks at that surge and says,
They say, see, the illness is back. It's even worse than before. You clearly need this drug. You're sick.
So they mistake the withdrawal, the body's completely predictable, mechanical adaptation to the drug for the return of the original disease.
Every single time. So they put the drug back, maybe at a higher dose, or they add a second drug to manage the anxiety caused by withdrawing from the first. The ratchet clicks forward one more notch.
And the half-turn system, because it's not looking at the long-term or the causal chain, it can't distinguish between the person's distress and the treatment's own echo.
It's a chemical dependency loop that masterfully disguises itself as a medical necessity. The source calls it structural entrapment.
That is heavy. And a good place to transition. Let's move to segment 2. If coercion and medication are the hands of this system, then diagnosis is its eyes. And the text argues that the eyes are, for all intents and purposes, broken. It calls this section the diagnosis trap, static labels in dynamic systems.
Right, and this goes back to that difference between a photograph and a movie.
Yeah.
Human beings are dynamic systems. We are trajectories through time. We change based on context, stress, relationships, even the time of day. But a diagnosis, a DSM code, is a snapshot. It freezes one moment of distress and turns it into a static, permanent identity.
The source calls this cognitive compression.
It's a great term. We take this massive, complex, high-resolution file, a person's entire life story of trauma, their recent divorce, their poverty, their sleep deprivation, their genetic vulnerabilities, and we compress it into a tiny, low-resolution zip file called major depressive disorder.
But, I mean, don't we have to do that? We need to compress information to function, right? For billing, for communicating between doctors. If I call another doctor about a patient, I can't spend an hour telling them the whole life story. I have to start with, this patient has depression.
Of course, we absolutely need shorthand. The problem isn't the existence of shorthand. The problem arises when the shorthand replaces the reality. And this creates a fundamental conflict between what the text calls administrative truth and clinical truth.
Explain the difference.
Clinical truth is what is actually happening in the room between the clinician and the patient. It's messy, it's evolving, it's nuanced. This person is overwhelmed because their partner left, they lost their job, and they can't sleep. That's the clinical truth.
And administrative truth.
Administrative truth is the billing code. It's the legal status. It's the box you can tick in the electronic health record. It is what is legible to the bureaucracy.
And in a fight between those two?
Administrative truth wins. Always. It has to.
Well, it has to.
Because administrative truth is what controls the resources. It controls the money, the housing, the disability payments. Let me give you a really common scenario.
Please.
A clinician sees a patient who is deeply distressed, maybe hearing some voices, primarily because they're homeless and haven't slept safely in weeks. The clinical truth is this person needs housing and safety. Simple.
But there's no billing code for needs housing.
Exactly. And the supportive housing program in their city requires a formal diagnosis of a severe and persistent mental illness, like schizophrenia, to even qualify for a bed.
So the clinician is stuck. They either tell the clinical truth and the person stays on the street, or they,
Oh,
what, lie, exaggerate.
they have to code up. They are incentivized, even forced, to assign the diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, not because it's a perfect clinical fit, but because it is the key that unlocks the door to the resource the person actually needs. The diagnosis stops being a description and starts being a router.
But then that label, schizophrenia, it sticks to them.
It sticks like superglue. Forever. That person is now a schizophrenic in the eyes of the entire system. If they get into a child custody battle 5 years later, that label will be used against them. If they go to the ER for a broken arm and are crying in pain, the staff might see the label in their chart and dismiss them as being psychiatric or drug-seeking.
The administrative truth begins to cannibalize their actual life.
It does. And this leads to the most tragic outcome, which the source calls identity collapse.
The patient starts to believe the label themselves.
It's the saddest part of this whole process. You stop seeing yourself as a person who is struggling with a specific set of problems in a specific context, and you start seeing yourself as a fundamentally defective machine. I am a bipolar. I am a schizophrenic. It becomes totalizing.
Once you believe that you are, by nature, defective,
You surrender your agency. You stop trying to solve your problems, and you wait for the mechanic to come and fix you.
which brings us right back to the half-turn. If you're waiting for the mechanic, and the only tool the mechanic has is a hammer.
You get hammered every time.
Okay. We have stared into the abyss here. We've seen the mechanics of the half-turn, the feedback blindness, the coercion cascades, the polypharmacy ratchets, the diagnostic traps. It is a bleak picture.
It is.
But the source material is not a eulogy. It's a blueprint for something different. So let's pivot. Segment 3, the full-turn solution.
This is the pivot from suppression to closure.
I like that. So the text outlines 6 very specific conditions for what it calls closing the loop. This is like the core checklist for a system that actually works, that completes its reasoning. And I want to go through these one by one because they really redefine what care even means.
Let's do it.
Okay, condition number 1, causal adequacy.
This is the root cause test. It's a simple but profound question. Did we actually fix the driver of the problem? If a person is depressed because of ongoing domestic violence, and we give them an antidepressant but send them right back to the violent partner, the intervention is causally inadequate. It fails this first test.
The full-turn system would demand that we address the environmental or structural root, not just the biological symptom that it produces.
Correct. You have to fix the leak, not just keep mopping the floor.
Number 2, proportional intervention.
This is the sledgehammer to crack a nut test. It measures the amount of force used. A full-turn system would actually track the force-to-outcome ratio. If you achieve stability, but you had to use physical restraints and involuntary injections to do it, that's a failure of proportionality. You use too much gain.
Number 3, and this feels like the big one to me, agency preservation.
It is the linchpin of the entire model. The question here is, did the patient retain or even increase their ability to choose? Did our intervention empower them to manage their own life better next time, or did it make them more helpless and dependent on us? If a person's agency drops as a result of our care, the loop is not closed. You haven't solved the problem. You just kicked the can down the road and made the person less able to catch it next time.
Number 4, temporal sufficiency.
This is about the time frame. The half-turn system looks at a snapshot. A full-turn system looks at the whole movie. It asks, did we check for harm 6 months later, 2 years later, 5 years later? You cannot declare victory at the hospital exit door. The system has to own the timeline of the person's life, not just the timeline of the admission.
Number 5, iatrogenic accounting.
Iatrogenic is just a fancy word for harm caused by the healer. A full-turn system would be brutally honest and calculate the cost of its own help. It would have to say, okay, we reduced the psychosis score by 10 points, but our treatment caused 40 pounds of weight gain and complete sexual dysfunction. That isn't a footnote on a drug insert. In this system, that is a debt on the balance sheet of care.
It has to be counted.
It has to be counted as part of the outcome.
And finally, number 6, system revision.
This is the learning part. Did the machine learn? If this specific patient came back to the ER 3 times with the same crisis, did we change the protocol for them? Or did we just shrug and label the patient treatment-resistant or non-compliant?
So a full-turn system assumes that if the patient fails, It's actually the system that failed.
The system failed to find the right solution. Yes.
So this is great checklist. It's an ideal. But how do we actually implement it? We can't just wish it into existence. The text proposes a very concrete mechanical change, replacing the diagnosis as the central organizing principle with something called phenomenology and formulation.
Right. This is the engine replacement. This is the core architectural change. Instead of starting with a label, what DSM category do they fit, we start with phenomenology, which just means what is actually happening.
The raw experience.
We meticulously record the raw experience before filtering it through a diagnostic code. What are they feeling, seeing, thinking, believing? We preserve the meaning and the context, and we prevent that premature labeling that shuts down all other thinking.
And then from that raw data, we build a causal formulation. The text describes this as a graph, and I want our listeners to really try and visualize this.
Yeah, imagine a big whiteboard. Instead of writing major depression in a circle in the middle, you start drawing nodes or bubbles. You draw a bubble for insomnia. You draw another bubble for recent job loss, a bubble for increased alcohol use, a bubble for childhood trauma.
So you're mapping out the components of their distress.
Exactly. And then you start drawing lines, edges, connecting them, with arrows showing the direction of causality. Job loss leads to increased alcohol use. Increased alcohol use leads to insomnia. Insomnia leads to suicidal thoughts. You're not creating a label, you're building a map of the mechanism, a causal circuit board.
And the beauty of a map like that is that it allows for simulation.
It does. You can look at that board with the patient and say, okay, look at this map. If we intervene right here at the insomnia node, if we can just fix your sleep, what do we predict will happen to the suicidal thoughts node? You can model what ifs. You simply cannot do that with a static black box label like depression.
And you said with the patient, you can show this map to the person themselves.
That's the most powerful part. You turn the whiteboard around and you say, does this look like your life? Did we get the arrows right? And the patient can say, no, actually, the alcohol use isn't caused by the job loss. It's caused by the chronic pain in my back you didn't even ask about. So you erase a line and you redraw it. You are co-authoring the map of their own suffering.
That immediately restores agency. You're making them the expert on their own experience.
They become a scientist of their own life.
The text mentions that the diagnosis, the DSM code, doesn't completely disappear in this model, but it gets demoted.
It gets demoted from being the governor to being an index. It's like the Dewey Decimal System in a library. We still need it to file the paperwork and for statistical tracking, but we don't use the catalog number to treat the person. The formulation is the boss of the decision. The diagnosis is just the secretary that handles the filing.
I love that framing. We need indexes, not prisons. But, even a map can become rigid. A formulation could become its own kind of dogma. The text anticipates this and talks about building in anti-absolutism rules.
This is the crucial safety valve. The system must be designed to admit it might be wrong. So every formulation must have an expiry date. This is our working theory for the next 30 days, and we must review it.
Can't be permanent.
Never. And it must explicitly list competing hypotheses. So the formulation would say, our primary hypothesis is that this is driven by trauma, but a competing hypothesis is that it could be a thyroid issue. If our trauma-informed approach doesn't work within X weeks, we must immediately pivot and investigate the thyroid.
It forces humility into the logic of the system.
Which is the only known antidote to dogmatism.
Now we have to get to the math. Segment 4, the mathematical foundations. I know some listeners might hear equations and their eyes might glaze over, but stick with us, because this is where the deterministic part of the paper's title really comes in. The text claims you can literally model and simulate the trajectory of a patient using a set of state variables.
It's basically treating the patient's state at any given time at t as a vector, a collection of numbers. So you have the obvious ones. ST for symptom severity, RT for risk level, MT for medication dose, CT for coercion level.
The things the half-turn system already looks at.
Yes, but the game changers are the variables the half-turn system ignores. AT for agency, the patient's capacity for self-governance, and LT, which they call iatrogenic load, the accumulated tax of treatment, the side effects, the trauma, the stigma.
So let's run the fatal equation, as they call it. Let's simulate a standard half-turn interaction using these variables.
Okay, let's take our patient John again.
John comes in during a crisis, so his S symptoms variable is very high.
The half-turn system's only goal is to lower S, so its algorithm is simple. Increase M medication and increase C coercion.
It works. S drops, the shouting stops, he's calm. On the surface, it looks like a success, right?
In the short term, from the
Yeah.
outside, yes.
But now let's look at the hidden variables that the system doesn't track. Because we used high levels of coercion, C, John's agency crashes. He feels powerless. And because we used high-dose medication, his iatrogenic load, L, the burden of side effects, starts to climb.
John is discharged. His S is low, but his A is near 0. The text posits a fundamental law. Long-term stability is a direct function of agency. If A is low, the system is inherently unstable.
So he goes home. He feels powerless. He feels sick and groggy from the meds.
And because his agency is low, he can't cope with the normal stresses of life. The spring has been compressed by external force.
The rebound, the moment that external control is lifted, the moment he's back in his life, spikes again. And because the spring is so compressed, it often spikes higher than it was before.
The system sees that new higher spike, and its algorithm says our intervention wasn't strong enough.
So it increases M&C again, even more this time.
And the loop tightens. Each cycle, agency goes lower, iatrogenic load goes higher, and the symptom volatility becomes more and more extreme.
That is the fatal equation. The math demonstrates that you cannot achieve long-term stability by only manipulating M&C. It's mathematically impossible. You have to solve for A.
That's it. The goal of a full-term equation would be entirely different. It would be, how do we lower symptoms by raising agency A and lowering the upstream stress load? If you can figure out how to lower symptoms while keeping agency high or even increasing it, the system becomes self-stabilizing.
The patient takes over the job of being the regulator of their own system.
It sounds intuitive, but the math proves it's the only way to stop the violent oscillations. It's the only way to create a stable landing.
It's the shift from external control to internal governance.
Precisely.
So, finally, segment 5, system learning. The text calls this the only real exit. And I have to admit, I have to be the skeptic here. We're talking about massive, lumbering bureaucracies, insurance companies, giant hospital chains, government health departments. The idea that these giants can learn and revise their own behavior feels, well, a little optimistic.
It would be if it were just a suggestion. It can't be a memo that says, please try to learn. It has to be algorithmic. It has to be built into the structure. The text proposes creating mandatory revision protocols. Think of it like an airline safety system.
How so?
If a plane crashes, the NTSB doesn't just write a report blaming the pilot. They find the systemic flaw and they issue a directive that redesigns the cockpit or retrains every pilot or changes the maintenance schedule. The learning is mandatory and it changes the whole system.
So in this model, if a patient bounces back to the ER 3 times in 1 month,
The electronic health record would trigger a hard-coded alarm. Not an alarm that flashes bad patient or non-compliant, but an alarm that flashes failed care pathway. It would literally lock the previous protocol. It would generate a message saying, you are not permitted to use the same intervention a 4th time. A multidisciplinary case review is now mandatory.
it forces a hard stop. It breaks the loop.
It forces a strategy meeting. It forces the system to stop and ask, is our causal formulation wrong? What are we missing? It takes the discretion away from the single, exhausted clinician who might just want to write another script to get through the day, and it mandates a collective, full-turn analysis.
This completely reframes the idea of chronicity, doesn't it?
It turns it on its head. Right now, chronic is a label of despair we stick on the patient. They are chronic schizophrenic. It implies they are unfixable. The text argues that chronicity is not a patient attribute. It is a measure of system inadequacy.
So if a patient is labeled chronic, it's actually an indictment of the system's failure to solve their problem.
It means the system has failed over and over to find a causal resolution for that individual. The chronicity is in the system's response, not in the person's soul.
That is a massive shift in responsibility. It sounds like it would put a lot of pressure on doctors to feel responsible for that.
You know, I think it does the opposite. I think it relieves a specific kind of pressure. Right now, clinicians suffer from absolutely terrible rates of burnout and what's called moral injury.
That's the feeling of being forced to do things that go against your own values.
Right. They feel like individual heroes trying to hold back the tide with a teaspoon. They know the system is broken. They know they're being forced to coerce people. They know the medications are harmful, but they feel trapped. They have to work within the half-turn rules.
They feel guilty for the coercing they have to do just to get through the day.
Exactly. This model shifts the burden from individual heroism and individual failure to system responsibility. The clinician isn't the failure, the architecture is. And if the architecture is designed to learn and improve, then the clinician becomes an operator of a learning machine, not a scapegoat for a broken one.
So we've covered a huge amount of ground here. We've gone from the dirty windshield of feedback truncation all the way to the causal maps and mathematical models of the full turn. What does this all mean for the listener? I mean, most of us aren't psychiatrists or hospital administrators. How do we use this?
I think it means we need to fundamentally change what we ask for. When we look at the mental health crisis, our default is always to ask for more. More beds, more pills, more funding for the existing system.
But more of a broken system just gets you more broken outcomes.
More of a half-turn system just produces more coercion and more chronicity, only faster and more efficiently. We shouldn't be asking for more. We should be demanding different.
You should be asking for closure.
We should be asking for the return arc. We should be asking the system to finish its sentences.
I keep coming back to that simple checklist of 6 questions. Especially, did we close the loop?
That's the test. That is the question you can take away from this depth dive. The next time you encounter a treatment plan, whether it's for yourself or for a loved one, just quietly ask that question.
Is this intervention just pausing the signal? Is it just suppressing the scream?
Or is it genuinely trying to understand why the scream is happening? And is it building the person's capacity to stop it from needing to happen again?
Are we freezing the person in place, or are we actually helping them learn to walk on their own?
Exactly. That's the whole thing. We have to be brave enough as a society to look at the long term. We have to be willing to measure the harm that we cause in the name of help. And if we can do that, if we can build a system that respects the full, complex, and often difficult circle of human experience, we might finally stop just managing mental illness and actually start resolving it.
That's the full turn. Thank you for diving deep with us today on this.
A pleasure. Until next time.